Today on the 21st show, when it comes to the most contentious issues in our politics, guns, abortion, the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, what do you know to be true? What are you certain of? Illinois sociologist Ilana Redstone says you're probably certain of too much. Her recent book is called The Certainty Trap: Why We Need to Question Ourselves More and How We Can Judge Others Less. I'm Brian Mackey, and we're talking with Ilana Redstone for the hour today on the 21st show, which is a production of Illinois Public Media, airing on WILL in Urbana, WUIS in Springfield, WGLT in Normal, WNIJ in DeKalb, WVIK in the Quad Cities, and WSIU in Carbondale. But first, the news. From Illinois Public Media, this is the 21st show. I'm Brian Mackey. We live in an age of certainty. Many of our fellow Americans are certain that people with different political views are not just wrong, but are actually evil. I mean, why would someone oppose common sense gun safety laws? Obviously, it's because they don't care about the scores of children who've been killed in mass shootings. And while we're on that subject, why would someone want to impose strict gun control laws? Obviously, because they don't care about freedom, and they only want to honor the parts of the Constitution that align with their political beliefs. This sort of disagreement is at the heart of the new book, The Certainty Trap: Why We Need to Question Ourselves More and How We Can Judge Others Less. Its author is Ilana Redstone, who's also an associate professor of sociology at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. I talked with her about this book back in September, which means today's program is on tape, but you can let us know what you thought by emailing talk@21stshow.org. Here now is our conversation with Ilana Redstone about The Certainty Trap. So you open the first chapter of your book by quoting one of the best remembered, I guess we could say one of the few remembered commencement addresses. This is the late David Foster Wallace speaking at Kenyon College in 2005.
There are these two guys sitting together in a bar in the remote Alaskan wilderness. One of the guys is religious, the other's an atheist, and the two are arguing about the existence of God with that special intensity that comes after about the fourth beer. And the atheist says, look, it's not like I don't have actual reasons for not believing in God. It's not like I haven't ever experimented with the whole God and prayer thing. Just last month, I got caught away from camp in that terrible blizzard, and I was totally lost, and I couldn't see a thing, and it was 50 below. And so I tried it. I fell to my knees in the snow and cried out, oh God, if there is a God, I'm lost in this blizzard, and I'm going to die if you don't help me. And now, in the bar, the religious guy looks at the atheist all puzzled. Well, then you must believe now, he says. After all, here you are, alive. The atheist just rolls his eyes. No, man, all that was a couple Eskimos happened to come wandering by and they showed me the way back to camp.
How many footprints in the snow? All right, Ilana Redstone, what do you hear there?
That speech by David Foster Wallace is one thing. It was something that inspired me to think much more deeply about the problem of certainty, and also to frame it in the way that I ended up framing it. And so what I hear is this limitation in how we think, and the effects that certainty can have on how we think about what's true, what's real, and ultimately, and I don't think Wallace says this in that speech, but ultimately how we end up judging and condemning really the character of other people.
So let's get into it then. What is the certainty trap?
So the easiest way to understand the certainty trap is by understanding how it feels when we're in it. And that actually turns out to be easier in some ways than coming up with an abstract definition. So when we're in it, we feel contemptuous of people who disagree. We feel righteously indignant. We feel morally outraged. And what's happening is so a couple of things can be happening. One is we're treating our knowledge as definitive rather than provisional. It's when we treat our for example, our preferred policy decision, as though it is all upside and no downside, or no downside worth considering, when we think the answers are simple and obvious. All of this is what paves the way for us to see somebody who disagrees as hateful or an idiot.
Yeah, you're reminding me of that. What is that quote from Thomas Sowell? There are no solutions, only trade-offs.
Yeah. Yes, that's a great quote. Yep.
So, okay, let's talk about this. Let's make this a little more concrete. So how do you see the certainty trap manifesting in some real-world contentious political issues?
So, I mean, I think that this tends to come up the more heated, the more contentious the issues. So, it tends to be often, but not exclusively, around issues around race and gender, because those tend to be some of the most heated and some of the most contentious. But anything that has a heavy moral component, so where we would say, and I can point to the class that I've taught here at the University of Illinois called Bigots and Snowflakes, where when we see, so the person who doesn't agree with my position on Black Lives Matter is therefore racist. Or the person who you started out with at the beginning, the person who doesn't agree with my position on gun control doesn't care about, the lives of children. Or the person who doesn't agree with my position on abortion is a misogynist. So all of these conclusions that we draw, and the point, and I try to make this very clearly in the book, is not that these things are impossible as explanations for a person's motivation. It's the willingness to question who's who and what's what, how do we know, and what does it mean if we're wrong, that matters a lot.
Maybe we can pick apart one of those examples
Sure.
you talked about, and you mentioned abortion, and that is something you hear, is that people who want to restrict abortion rights or reproductive health rights, they really want to just control women's bodies. And
Right.
So talk about how that plays into the notion of certainty.
Yeah, so that example actually, in the book, I talk about 3 fallacies, and one of them is sort of that comprise the certainty trap. One of them is the settled question fallacy, which is, again, this idea of what I just described at the beginning, sort of treating our knowledge as definitive rather than provisional. And I can go into this a lot more in the book. The other is something I call the fallacy of equal knowledge, which is the idea that when we disagree on something, and I'm going to come back to your abortion question in a second. When we disagree on something, what's keeping us apart is actually information. And so, in other words, if you knew what I knew, or if the other person knew what I knew, they would have the same opinion that I do. And that's not an argument that information doesn't matter or that education doesn't matter. It's a really narrow claim, but it's actually quite impactful, which is that if we all had the same information, that wouldn't lead to agreement on contentious issues.
I do want to come back to that, because I feel that in the media, if only we fact check Trump more, then everybody would understand that he tells lies all the time. So we can come back to that. So I think you're moving on to the third fallacy.
Well, I didn't want to bring up one without the context of the others. So the last one, which gets to your abortion example, this fallacy of known intent. And so the fallacy of known intent, sometimes we go straight there. This is basically when we make an assumption about our ideological or political opponent's intent, and it's rarely flattering. And so sometimes we can go straight to an assumption about their intent. A lot of times what happens is we start with the fallacy of equal knowledge, and we say, okay, and it's our version of kind of being charitable, right? Like, well, this person just doesn't have the right information, and so therefore that's why they don't agree. They're ignorant, et cetera. And one of 2 things often happens. One is the person demonstrates that they have, an adequate command of the topic, whatever it is, right? So you can no longer sort of just pass it off as ignorance. Or you spend half an hour explaining all of the information that you think that they should have, and they don't change their mind. And then you slide right into this assumption about their intent. So to come back to your abortion example, I think that, and in the book I talk about this, so that we should be skeptical of arguments that are based or hung on, and what's another way to think about it, assumptions about anyone else's intent. And it's actually really an important thing. So when you say, the person who agrees, who thinks that, who is opposed to abortion rights, or who favors a more restrictive abortion access or completely restrictive abortion, right? Whatever the position is, that they are driven by a desire to control women's bodies or misogyny or whatever sort of motive. It's incumbent on all of us to come up with a version of the other side's argument that would make sense to us. And by make sense, I mean that isn't hung on an assumption about their intent. And we can talk about if it's not obvious why that matters. We can talk about why that matters.
Yeah.
But do you want me to go into that now?
Well, let's talk about that, because one of the big project of your book is this idea that it's not that we're going to convince everyone to agree with us.
Yeah.
It's that we need to find a way to live together in our society with people who don't agree with us.
Yeah. I mean, we have to, that agreement is fundamentally not the goal. And living with disagreement is the goal. And it's not only living with disagreement, it's living with disagreement without contempt. And I don't mean that in a kind of let's hug it out and like everybody should get along kind of way. I mean it in if what you want to do is preserve democracy or have a stable, robust, strong democracy, you can't actually, that is incompatible with political parties treating one another with contempt, which destroys social trust. It destroys trust in institutions, plural. And it basically, it's incredibly divisive. So that contempt is really the problem that the certainty trap is trying to solve, but coming at it from a very much of this has implications for democracy, and this is fundamentally a problem of how we think.
Let me take a moment to remind listeners this is the 21st show. We're talking with Ilana Redstone, who's on the faculty in sociology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and her new book is called The Certainty Trap: Why We Need to Question Ourselves More and How We Can Judge Others Less. So you mentioned the three fallacies, and I kind of jumped ahead to the fallacy of known intent. You start with this idea of the settled question fallacy and spend a good amount of time on that in the book. What are some examples you've heard of people treating questions as settled that are in fact not settled?
Well, so one of the things that I try and say in the book is that actually it's not like this is settled and that's settled. It's that really when it comes to, and there are people a lot smarter than I am that who have made this point, and I point to that in the book, that there is no final whistle, right, with anything. And so I talk a lot in the book about the importance of moving from certainty to confidence. That doesn't mean that because leaving certainty behind in that sense is not the same thing as saying, well, whether the earth is flat or a spheroid is suddenly a coin flip, right? Because you're basically thinking about this realm of confidence you can think of it as a number line that goes from 0 to 1, but you've sort of cut off the endpoints, which reflect certainty. So the settled question fallacy, so recognizing that our knowledge is provisional rather than definitive. So what does that mean? That means all kinds of uncomfortable things, so it means that you, for example, so if you want to just tie it to a really contentious issue, gender and biology, it means that what we know and understand about the relationship between gender and biology is not definitive, about whether gender is entirely a social construct, whether it's not, whether there's a biological basis for it. There's evidence, although you can find evidence supporting all kinds of claims on that topic. I don't want to, again, I'm just using that as an example. Yeah. Another sort of very contentious topic where that would come up would be inequality. All kinds of inequality in terms of whether we view how we think about the causes of and solutions to inequality. And when we think of them as definitive, when we think of anything as definitive, it's permission to be very dismissive of anybody who sees it differently. And that's a problem of how we think.
Are there no questions that are settled? Or like how should we think about a phrase like human enslavement is wrong?
Yeah. So
Seems pretty settled, right?
Well, that's interesting. So when you get I'm trying to think about how to answer that without going into the philosophical weeds, which is where I like to play sometimes. The way this works, it's not actually, the certainty trap is not a moral argument. I'm not saying, I get two questions fairly regularly with this work. One is, well, and I sort of addressed it earlier, does this mean that we can't that whether the Earth is flat or spheroid is a coin flip, right? So I think I've addressed that one. But the other question that I get fairly regularly is that people will think that what I'm saying is if we're leaving certainty behind and we're avoiding this certainty trap, then that means that we can no longer say this is good, this is bad, slavery is bad in Europe, for example, et cetera. And that's not actually what I'm saying at all, because the way it works. So let's say you have an issue that is contentious and people disagree about it. What I'm saying, and I started to say this before, our obligation in a democracy, right, is to come up, even if it's just in our minds, with a version of that argument that would make sense to us. And I said before what I meant by making sense. If you can't, right, and there are cases where you can't, and slavery is a great example for that. If you can't, what is your commitment? What is your sort of intellectual commitment? It's to being very clear and precise about what principle or value for you're bumping up against. And so it actually, the way it works out is that the more sort of egregious and awful something is, the easier it is to name that principle. So, for example, going back to your question about like, well, are you, and the way sometimes people phrase this is, are you both siding slavery? No, not at all. Because when in an example like that, I can just say, you know what we're bumping up against, with the value might be, I think all human beings have equal moral value. Or I think no human being should enslave another. Now, part of my commitment in avoiding the certainty trap, your high level commitment, is understanding that any idea, value, principle, etc., can be questioned or challenged. Nothing gets a free pass. So that would mean that someone could challenge me. They could say, okay, well, you think all lives have equal moral value. I don't agree. And maybe I want to have that discussion. Maybe I don't. I've actually had someone challenge me on that before. But it means that I'm willing to do that.
All right, we need to take a break. We're going to have more with Ilana Redstone when we return. Her book is called The Certainty Trap: Why We Need to Question Ourselves More and How We Can Judge Others Less. This conversation's on tape, but let us know what you thought by voicemail. 217-300-2121 is the number. This is the 21st show. Stay with us. It's the 21st show. I'm Brian Mackey. We're listening back to our conversation with Ilana Redstone about her recent book, The Certainty Trap: Why We Need to Question Ourselves More and How We Can Judge Others Less. Redstone is also on the faculty at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in sociology. Our show is on tape today, but you can email us at talk@21stshow.org. We're curious, what are the things that you are certain of? And I don't know, maybe the election is making you reevaluate them. Do you ever want to challenge something you hear? Or maybe you feel like, yes, I should be certain of this and it's not up for debate. Let us know. The address is talk@21stshow.org. All right, back to our conversation with Ilana Redstone. All right, and I want to raise some of these points because especially I know you've done a lot of research and work and thinking about the sort of idea of diversity and equity and inclusion, DEI as it's known. And, I know you've heard some of these critiques of your framework, and it's something we hear a lot. Like if you're talking about LGBT issues, for example, somebody would say, my right to exist is not up for debate. How do you think of that in the context of the certainty trap?
Yeah, I think so. It's such a good question, and I have an interesting story about that. So one thing I want to just make clear is for your listeners, if anyone is sitting and thinking about this, one of the things that I think is important to point out is that not all certainty is a trap in the way that I'm talking about this in the book. And so if I'm holding my reading glasses here, like I don't have to question whether we're living in the matrix. There's an interesting philosophical question, there are interesting questions there. But when it comes to democracy, when it comes to social stability, when it comes to how we get along, the trap part is the contempt. Right. I love the philosophical piece and I go into it a little bit in the book, but the trap part really is the contempt. So I wanted to just make that clear. When it comes to DEI and sort of, how did you put it? There's a quote, there's there's a quote that's often attributed to James Baldwin that is that, and I don't know.
Oh, right. Oh,
I don't.
my right to exist is not up for debate, or something
Yeah,
along
it's
those
something
lines.
like if we can agree to disagree and still love one another. I'm probably getting it wrong. I'm sure there are listeners who know this. As long as your disagreement is rooted in my oppression or something like that. So it's something along the same idea. And on the one hand, like this is just it's this very powerful idea. It's this very like I'm drawing this hard line in the sand, and this is your denial of my right to exist, right? So it can be it's powerful and empowering at the same time, right? So it has all of these positive things, positive attributes about it. I'm just going to focus on that particular quote for a second because I think there's sort of a small piece and a big piece that I'll talk about. One is this idea that we have to either get along or we don't interact at all, right? That like that's just binary. That either we can love each other, and again, I'm focusing on the quote that's often attributed to Baldwin. That's one piece. The bigger piece is when you say your opinion, and I want to get back to what your example as well. If you say like your position, your disagreement is rooted in my oppression, how do you know if someone's disagreement or their position is rooted in their oppression, right? Like, so part of it is understanding that this is why I said earlier, like coming up with a version of the other argument that makes sense to you.
Yeah.
Because what happens is, let's say, and I've done this with students before. Let's say, if I sit in front of a room of students and I say, can you tell me, and I'm in the sociology department. I say, can you tell me what are some of the benefits of an idea like white privilege? And they say, okay, well, it helps us think about the importance of unearned advantage, or it helps us think about the way race continues to play a role in everyday life. Totally, in my view, totally reasonable answers, right? Like, I'm like, yep, that makes sense. And then I say, okay, can you tell me something about why someone might object to or have concerns about this concept? And what they'll often come up with at first, mostly I'll get silence for a while, but is something like, well, they don't understand the reality of racism. Now we're right into the fallacy of equal knowledge, right? Like that's the first thing. And that, again, I'm not saying that that's not a possibility, but if I push them on it and you say, okay, well, no, like, okay, that may be true. Yep, maybe they don't understand racism, but there's a lot of assumptions that are going into that statement.
If only they'd read that Ta-Nehisi Coates piece in
right,
the Atlantic.
exactly,
Yeah,
right, or whatever the assumption is, right. And so when you press people and you sort of lead them down this path of thinking about it, you can get to some place like, okay, well, maybe they see it. Maybe, there's a world where it can be kind of divisive. There's also an assumption about how do we know what kinds of privilege matter and how much they matter and how much, so the color, for example, like how much the fact that I have tenure and I'm at the University of Illinois, et cetera, how much of it is because I'm white? It's probably not zero. It's probably not 100. But like how much is it? So this is certainty, right? This is how do we think about the answers to those questions? So is there a version of the objection in this example to white privilege that I could kind of make sense of that isn't hung on any of these assumptions? And what happens is there's a totally separate question about how likely do you think that is? Let's say you then encounter somebody who thinks white privilege is, the worst idea to ever emerge. Now you have multiple possible explanations for how they might have gotten to that position. But now there's not only one, there's two. And so then you can think about this, well, what if I'm wrong? How do I know if I'm wrong? So this idea of thinking about someone's intent. And so with the DEI space, and this goes back to to the abortion example, to all of the stuff we were talking about earlier. In the DEI case, what ends up happening is that a lot of traditional DEI, what's thought of as DEI work and DEI programming, takes a lot of assumptions as given, particularly about inequality and particularly about how we do and should think about identity. And all of that stuff is just taken as given. Here's our starting rate. For example, race and gender are the most important ways that we do and should think about identity. Impact matters more than intent. Inequality is determined by discrimination. I'm not necessarily taking a stand that I disagree with any of these, but I'm saying it's the treating them as definitive that actually leads to problems. And so if you stop doing that, you can still say, well, we want an environment, to talk about the DEI thing, we want an environment that's inclusive, that's sort of welcoming to everybody. But if part of what you're talking about is welcoming people who have a different political ideology, right, then that is basically a reshuffling of that deck of how we think about what that means.
I'm totally bought into the idea, personally, of the idea that the world is much more complicated than narratives that can fit into a media news story or a political speech or even a political ad, especially. It's a complicated world, right? But I think there's a certain way in which that's really unsatisfying for people. And I wonder if you encounter that, right? Because people, it's gratifying to be certain about things in a way that it's not gratifying to simply shrug your shoulders and say, I don't know, it's complicated.
Yeah. Well, so one thing I want to say is that there's nothing about avoiding certainty or avoiding the certainty trap that means that you have to sit paralyzed with indecision for the rest of your life, right? You can take stands, you can advocate, you can be an activist, you can do all of those things. But it should change. What it will change, if you're really sort of taking this to heart and you're really internalizing this, is how you view people who disagree with you, right? So that's I think one point. It does feel good to be certain. It feels really good to be certain. And so I think one of the things that I said early on in the book is that for this to matter, at the end of the day, you have to care about something more than you care about being right. I, for one, I have been long interested in moral and ethical complexity. I just find it interesting. But part of that, I think, comes from, there's several places that comes from. One of them is just, I had the experience early, after college, where I did a lot of traveling. And part of what that experience taught me, and again, this combines with other factors, is that the world is really full of people who are just trying to do the best they can. And that seems like a really kind of basic and obvious statement, but it also applies to the people who have ideas that you hate. And that it's not just the people that you agree with. It's the ones you don't agree with too.
Let me take a moment to remind listeners this is the 21st show. We are listening back to our conversation with Ilana Redstone about her book, The Certainty Trap: Why We Need to Question Ourselves More and How We Can Judge Others Less. Because our program is on tape, the callers you hear are not live, but you can call us and leave a voicemail at 217-300-2121. We always love hearing what you think about our show. Again, that number, voicemail line, 24/7 is 217-300-2121. And let's go now to the phones. Nathan is calling from Peoria on line 1. Nathan, thank you for calling in.
Hi. So you were talking about, is there like one thing that you can be absolutely certain of? And I would say the one thing that I can be 100% certain of is that I exist in some form. It's the whole I think, therefore I am philosophy, where even if everything around me is not how I perceive it, even if I'm wrong about everything else, I at least exist in the form to experience things. So I exist in some form.
Everything else is up for grabs, Nathan?
Yeah. So, I'm a pretty rational person. So I do believe the world exists. I can, matter, I think, exists, all that. But there's a whole idea of like, well, what if your entire life is an illusion? Like there's always these philosophical arguments.
Right. Are we in the Matrix? Yes.
Yeah, but I'd say the one thing that cannot be argued is whether or not I exist in some form, because even if I myself am some kind of creation or delusion, I at least exist in the form to experience the things around me.
All right, Nathan, thank you so much for the call. I appreciate it.
No, I love it. It's great. It's a great point. And it gets into the sort of more philosophical side of this work, which, again, probably not everyone finds interesting, but I find really interesting. So, yeah, and I actually talk about the cogito in the book, and the sort of I think, therefore I am, and sort of the search to find the one thing that can't be refuted. And I go into that, I guess, so I think there's a lot of interesting philosophy there. I think that this is part of what I was trying to say before, is that the problem of the certainty trap, again, is focused on the problem of contempt. So if the certainty is not leading to the kind of contempt that we're talking about, then it's an interesting philosophical question. I find it interesting, but it doesn't have the same effects on all of the things that we talked about: social trust, trust in institutions, all of these other things. So I'm with you, Nathan. I think it's a super interesting philosophical question. I'm there.
Let's take another call. Joris from Bloomington on line 2. Joris, thank you for calling in.
Okay.
You're on.
Okay. My own suggestion is that I always think of myself as incomplete across the whole board of everything, and therefore I'm not certain and I'm not absolute. I always feel as though there's some part of me that needs to be finished, to be made more complete.
Fascinating. Thank you, Joris.
That's great.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We're getting the prairie philosophers.
I love it.
Going
No, it's
today.
great.
Maybe we can make it a little more concrete. One of the things you have said, and you argue in the book, is that certainty is democracy's existential threat. Make that case.
Yeah, I actually think this is a huge point that we tend to. And we were talking before about I was listening to a podcast this morning that made this point very clearly for me. So we tend to talk, and as we're coming up on an election, even more so, we tend to talk about threats to democracy. People are understandably very concerned about democratic stability, what could be, what creates democratic stability, what potentially erodes democratic stability, or forget the potentially part, what does erode democratic stability. And one of the most common ways that we tend to think about this is as threats coming from the left or the right. And just to state the obvious, if you are on the left, you see that sort of embodied in Trump and sort of a lot of what he stands for. If you're on the right, you probably see it. And I don't mean to make any claim of equivalence here. That's not where I'm headed with this. But if you're on the right, you probably see that in sort of political correctness and excesses of political correctness. And so this framing does a couple of things. One thing that it does is it tricks us into forgetting that these two things, that in a democracy that there are feedback loops, that these two are actually intertwined, and that what one side does, particularly in essentially a two-party system, what one side does is often a response to or sort of of something the other side has done. So that it ignores this kind of feedback loop. The other thing that it does, and again, the it being this left-right framing, is it gives us permission to basically ignore our own role in creating the situation that we're in. So this last part, what I'll say next, there's another model of democracy that I think fits a lot better, of democratic stability, I should say. And it's not in the book, but I'll say it. It'll be in the next book. If you think of 3 blocks, if you think of sort of a tower made of 3 blocks, and the integrity of each block depends on the integrity of the one below it. So if one starts to crumble, then the whole thing can come down. And this tower is essentially democratic stability. At the top of that tower is what we might think of as the machinery of democracy. So this is all of the stuff that people generally see as a threat in Trump. So this is, separation of powers, limits on an executive power, an independent judiciary, free and fair elections, et cetera. Right underneath that is what you might think of as a commitment to political pluralism. So in other words, if that starts to crumble, it becomes why should I care about your free speech rights if I don't also have a commitment to political pluralism? Lots of organizations are focused on there are organizations focused on preserving democracy at the top. The commitment to political pluralism, you'll see that in lots of organizations that focus on political polarization, on civil discourse, sort of renewing our commitment at the middle. And at the bottom is making sure that there's a lack of contempt for people who disagree. That's the problem of certainty, and that's at that bottom level. That's a problem that it can impact everything above it. And so if we only focus on the top, we do so at the same time, we're actually making the bottom weaker.
All right, we're going to take another break. When we return, the rest of our conversation with Ilana Redstone. Her book is The Certainty Trap: Why We Need to Question Ourselves More and How We Can Judge Others Less. This is the 21st show. Stay with us.
Saying I love you
It's the 21st show. I'm Brian Mackey. We are listening back to our September conversation with the sociologist Ilana Redstone. Her latest book is called The Certainty Trap: Why We Need to Question Ourselves More and How We Can Judge Others Less. Our program's on tape, so no live calls, but you can let us know what you thought by emailing talk@21stshow.org. Again, we did broadcast this live back in September, and we returned to a call we got from Liz in DeKalb.
Hi. This is kind of an open question. I do appreciate that it was mentioned that there's not always necessarily contempt involved, but I do think we can compare three different scenarios, and I want to cite my source is the journalist and writer Jordan Sheridan. He wrote a book that just came out called We the Poisoned about Flint, Michigan, and he's compared how after 10 years Flint has not seen justice. And the case kind of crumbled after a lot of machinations happened. And East Palestine, Ohio is beginning, like they're still at the beginning of their journey for justice.
Where the train crash happened with a big chemical spill, right? Yeah.
Yes. And if you also look at another precedent made in Libby, Montana, where they had an asbestos issue, they now have universal health care for the citizens that live there. So I think that we can kind of compare things and use the precedent as part of consideration.
I think that's really, those are really interesting. Interesting examples, and I think the totally fair question. So I think with respect to those examples, I think that part of what I would say is, so I guess two things. One is that one of the ways to avoid this certainty trap that I'm talking about is to be really precise in our language, right? And to not use language, and I'm not necessarily saying that what Liz was saying wasn't precise, although I think there's one word that I'll point to that I think could use more precision, and that is justice, right? And so, which is not when I say that, I am not disagreeing. I'm not actually endorsing or condemning anything. I'm just saying it's actually not super precise, right? And so being clear about what that means, I think matters in terms of how we think about disagreement. Because when we set things up and we say people who get behind, it's like progress. Like people who get behind, the good people get behind progress and the bad people don't. The good people get behind, right? So it's this sort of framing. The other thing that I would say about these examples, and I'm going to use just a different example and then come back to it. The idea of what's right, and particularly when it comes to contentious issues, we can make lots of different arguments. And I'm not saying that they're all equally good. I'm saying that what makes it clear is being really clear about sort of what our goal is. And the example I'll give is, let's take the case of immigration. And this hopefully will relate back to the examples that Liz was giving. Let's say immigration. I don't know how we're supposed to have a conversation about what the right, best, fair, whatever immigration policy is until or unless we've been clear about what are we trying to do? So for example, is immigration fundamentally supposed to provide refuge to people from seeking better conditions, fleeing worse conditions, right? That would be one model. Or is immigration supposed to improve the economic conditions of people who are already in the host country? When we talk about in the examples that Liz gave, she gave the example of one town that ultimately got universal health care. This still comes down to there are all kinds of questions there about, well, what do we owe one another? It is philosophy. What are our obligations to one another? Every time that we think that we have a simple answer, sometimes it can be like in the example that Brian you gave earlier about slavery, it can be, but when it is, all this is saying is that we have a commitment, and I try to walk the walk too, to be really clear and precise about what that is, and we don't get to use language and words in a way that the person who disagrees with us wouldn't agree with, right? It's like we're explaining ourselves using language that's mutually intelligible.
Yeah. Well, and this is where This is one of the issues that I think we have and I'm glad we have a chance to come back to this, because something in the news industry, we have a limited amount of time, and same thing with politicians. They have a limited amount of time, and you are arguing for, I think, more complexity, and yet there are incentives towards simplification in our society. Talk about that tension and how.
Yeah. I think that's right. So I am definitely making an assumption in this book. And I think that it is not a bad assumption for most people most of the time. But I'm assuming that that people care about basically one of two things. One is reducing political polarization, strengthening democracy, right, et cetera. The other is, another possibility would be you just care, maybe you don't care about any of those things, but you care about understanding as best you can what's true about the world. Either of those things would work, but it doesn't. But the assumption breaks down in several situations, and I'll give you I think 3 examples. One is if you have. So, for example, with politicians, it's a great example, right? So politicians, I mean, I know you gave the example of media, and that's one of the examples too. Politicians, if what you're trying to do is win an election, you have an incentive to simplify your message. Vote for me, I'm the good guy. Don't vote for that person. She's the bad guy, right? And so that's a different set of that's neither of the 2 incentives that I said really need to hold true for this certainty trap to matter. Another example would be if what your goal is to build the biggest following on Twitter, X, whatever, that you possibly can, or Instagram, right? Or it works for the media example too. If that's your goal, outrage, and simplifying things is going to probably get you there a lot faster than sort of thoughtful contemplation. And I would say the third example would be if you are trying to control a narrative with lies. And I believe, let me be really specific about what I mean by lies. I don't mean something, Brian, you say something and I think what you're saying is not true. I mean, when I say lies, I mean something you don't believe to be true. And so if any of those, and I'm sure there are probably other examples as well, if you have a different set of incentives, this starts to break down. I do think that the assumption about caring about what's true or caring about sort of how we view the social fabric, I think it holds for most people most of the time. And I think it also has some pretty interesting implications for education, which we won't have time to talk about probably. But but it definitely doesn't hold for everybody all of the time.
Yeah. All right. One more caller on the line. Alita is calling from Normal on line 2. Alita, thanks for calling in.
Thanks for working me in before the end here. This sounds like a fabulous book, and I'm very excited about the premise. And I just wanted to ask your guest whether or not my experience in the wake of Trump being elected, a bunch of people in the community who were Democrats got together. We had some meetings, and I was like, I want to understand people in the right wing. I want to understand their psychology, what they're thinking, what motivates them. I want to understand them better. But it was intimidating on social media to do that because I would get slapped around a lot. So social media was hard. But we got together and started a book group. And one of the first books that we read was Strangers in Their Own Land by Arlie Hochschild. Mm-hmm. And a series of other books after that, just a whole bunch, How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith, and just trying to encompass viewpoints that maybe we weren't as familiar as we should be. Sure. And I was just wondering, has she heard of any right-wing groups trying to understand people on the left of the political spectrum?
That's such a good question, Alita. I appreciate that. And I have to say, as I was reading this book, I wonder if this isn't the stereotype would be that, liberal-minded, more open, or people are more open-minded. Literally, on one of the measures that political scientists use is open to new experiences. Mm-hmm. They might be more open to this project. Too, yeah. Mm-hmm. So, talk about that.
Yeah, I think it's so. I think I say this in the beginning of the book. Like this is sort of the perspective that I'm coming from. People have all kinds of arguments about, is Trump in particular, is he the cause or the effect of sort of this, a political climate that we've created? I think those are all interesting questions. I am I grew up in a very liberal town. I'm in a sociology department in higher education. Higher education leans left. Sociology within higher education leans left. If you go any further left, you'll probably fall off of something. And so, like, this is definitely my perspective. I do think that it's relevant in this, and I want to get back to Alita's question. I do think it's relevant in the sense that there is, particularly in education and the media would be the two main places, right, where there are political leanings, right? And I think the problem of certainty makes that even harder to point to, because it's the things that we're treat as certain that we're not even aware of that tend to be extremely problematic. So as to Alita's question about whether there are groups on the right, I don't know. I think it's a great question. My honest answer is I don't know.
I might point to Braver Angels, which is this
Braver Angels,
organization that has tried to have this cross-cultural dialogue. Although I don't know that you're getting people from the sort of Trump MAGA wing of the conservative movement, joining that.
I think there's a lot more to say about Alita's question that I would love to do, but I don't think we have time.
Yeah, we are running out of time. So maybe we can end with sort of a practical tip, right? What is one way we can know that we are about to tip over into the certainty trap, and give us a branch to grab onto to prevent ourselves from doing that? Yeah.
So I would say there's this sort of 3 steps. Well, maybe it's even 2. You're trying to, whatever the opinion is that you find objectionable, the position that you find objectionable, and you don't even need to do this with other people. Like, you could do it sitting in a room by yourself and just thinking, right? You're trying to think of a version of that argument that makes sense to you. And by makes sense, and I don't care, it doesn't have to be the version that's coming out of anyone's mouth. It's just this is about how we fundamentally think about ideas. And part of what you're doing is making sure that whatever version you come up with, it's not rooted in an assumption about the other person's intent or lack of information. If you can't, and this goes back to your example about slavery. When you can't, right, it is because you are bumping up against some sort of bedrock principle, like in the slavery example, right? And so then your commitment is to being clear about what that principle is. So to go back to the slavery example, not that anyone would do this, but like, I couldn't say, well, I disagree because it's evil. Not because it's not evil, right, depending on how you use that word, but like, because it's not precise enough. It's just not specific enough in terms of how I'm naming that principle. So those are the things that you can do. It does get easier.
And that was our conversation with Ilana Redstone, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Her book is The Certainty Trap: Why We Need to Question Ourselves More and How We Can Judge Others Less. And that is all the time we have for the show today. The 21st Show is a production of Illinois Public Media. I'm Brian Mackey. Thanks for listening. We'll talk with you again tomorrow.
It's called the Midwest. I was taught and brought up there, the laws to abide, and that the land that I live in has God on its side. Oh, the history books tell it. They tell it so well. The cavalry's charged, the Indians fell. The cavalry's charged, the Indians died. Oh, the country was young, with God on its side. The Spanish-American War had its day, and the Civil War too was soon laid away, and the names of the heroes I was made to memorize, with guns in their hands and God on their side. The First World War, boys, it came in